Steph, thanks so much for joining me on an N of One. You and I are old friends and old colleagues, and it's kind of notable because recently I've done a bunch of podcasts with folks who say things that I am jealous of. You know, someone came on the other day and they were like, yeah, and then when I was in college, right, a bunch of user researchers from Meta and a bunch of other companies came by and had a panel and told me about like how we use science at these companies. And I was like, yeah, when I was in college, there was no Meta. So
that's right.
Nobody came and had a panel about. I'm jealous. I'm jealous of folks who grew up in a place and a time where applied behavioral science was a thing. It was a career. It was a thing you went into. This was not true for you.
No. In fact, I think Facebook launched when I was in grad school, and like MySpace was the thing at that time.
Yeah. I love this. So this is going to be like, but let's go even farther back, like pre-grad school, pre-college, like all of that.
Oh my God, I suddenly feel like a dinosaur. Can we just...
No, but this is great because I finally get to talk to somebody who, you know, that was this part of the journey with me.
Yes.
Talk to me about
vintage. Like, we are vintage.
Steph as a kid. Well, you're like the OG, man. Like vintage Steph as a kid.
Yeah.
What did you think you wanted to be? You know, if I asked 12-year-old Steph Habif, like, okay, well, where's this all going?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah. So I grew up in a family of healthcare providers, nurses and doctors and stuff. And so health was always a thing. It's very much a core value. It was a big part of our family upbringing and culture. Like my friends growing up always used to tease me, and they used to love coming to my house because my parents, being that the very transparent, you know, healthcare providers that they were, you know, kids would come over, my friends would come over for dinner, and my dad would be like, so what are you guys talking about in school these days? What are you learning about? And in my health class, you know, like in 8th or 9th grade, I don't know, it was like the birds and the beads. And my dad be like, so should we talk about like how you get AIDS and like where HIV comes from? And like, just very, you know, no topic was, you know, off the table at my house. My friends to this day say how many first lessons they learned at my house, you know, with my family. And so this idea of transparency, health, authenticity, you know, sometimes life is really hard and scary, was kind of how I grew up. I'm very lucky. I consider myself very lucky for that reason. My parents were, you know, just, again, we could talk about anything. And half the time they forced me to talk about things that I really didn't want to talk about. You know what I mean? So that
early user research experiences.
So that explains a lot about me and my personality. I think my friends today would say that no topic is off the table. I've got this very curious mind about people in general. And it's just how I'm built. So that was Steph as a kid, you know, like I was like, people are interesting. People are fascinating.
People are interesting and fascinating. And so I go and I find 12-year-old Steph. What does she think that's going to manifest as? Like, you're coming from nurses and doctors. You're going to be a nurse and doctor. You're like, what does she think that is?
Yeah, well, 12-year-old Steph was getting into a lot of trouble. So I don't know if we want to talk about 12-year-old Steph. She was breaking all the rules. You know, she was...
Got it. So future career criminal.
Rebellion. Yeah. Yes. If you know, Steph at 12 was like, I idolized, you know, the pink ladies from Greece and Wonder Woman. And, you know, I just wanted to be this strong lady. I knew that I wanted to bring some power to whatever it is that I was going to do in the world. And so I was an athlete growing up too, which helped a lot. And so for me, I think very early on, I got curious about why people do what they do, especially because I was getting in a lot of trouble. And even in my own head afterwards, I'm like, God, why did I do that? You know, like what drove me to steal? What drove me to break the law? You know, and so that plus, I was the oldest in my family, and my younger siblings, I was always trying to convince them to do what I wanted them to do. Right. And so I was like, there's this superpower in being able to like make like convince people to do things.
So curiosity and manipulation. Basically, we're one alternate universe away from Steph being a super criminal. Was
Totally.
were you exposed to
Completely.
psychology in high school? Like, was this a class that you got? Like, was this an educational?
No, no, my path to psychology was actually through my sports. And so I was a really competitive athlete in high school. And the hardest part of sports for me and competition was always the mental part, right? It was always the how do you keep your frustration in check? You know, how do you make sure you don't completely talk yourself out of a competition or whatever? And so that was my Achilles heel as an athlete was my mind. And that's what in college I was a collegiate athlete, a very successful collegiate athlete, along with a lot of my teammates. And again, the psychology of sport and the mental part was just so hard. And so performance psychology was my first step into the psychology sciences. And that was
And you went to Waju in St. Louis. Did you
yes.
come in knowing like, hey, psychology, sports psychology is a thing that exists in the world, and I want to do that, or you kind of discovered that? Like, how does this evolve in college?
So sports psychology definitely was not a part of my college curriculum that was available, but psychology was for sure. And so I think, yes, I studied psychology and literature and history. I was kind of your classic, liberal arts major. But it was through my sport that I really kind of explored the world. And speaking of being a really curious person, I took advantage of, I studied abroad twice. I studied in Italy and I studied in England. And I think, again, different cultures, understanding, why are people the way that they are, being able to live in different countries at a younger age, that just propelled that curiosity. Like, why do groups of people do what they do or say what they say? And so I studied psychology as an undergraduate, and I really kind of, from the classroom to the real world, applied and explored a lot of those learnings as an athlete.
Mm. And
Um,
where did you think that was going professionally? So you're studying psychology. Do you think like, and then I'm going to become a clinical psychologist, and then I'm going to become a psychology professor? Like, where
I
is this going?
Yes. So I studied psychology and I was like, I really want to do something with psychology, but I was so immersed in my sport and my competitive athletics as an undergrad that like I didn't really plan that much. I was like, okay, so I know I love sports and I know I love psychology. So I took a gap year after my undergrad and I actually rode my bicycle across the United States. I was doing a lot of cycling at the time and met a friend whose mother passed away from brain cancer. And so we were able to organize, do a lot of fundraising for the American Cancer Society. And just, I literally spent months on my bicycle all around the United States, again, combining my passions of sport and people. I mean, I went to parts of the United States. I grew up right outside New York City. I grew up in Tenafly, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Manhattan. I was in rural, I don't even know where, for most of that summer that I was riding my bicycle. And it was so great. It was such a great way to meet new people. And so that gap year led me to apply to graduate school for sports psychology. So my master's degree is in counseling and sports psychology. And I did that at Springfield College in Massachusetts.
Wait, but I don't want to skip this. So you're riding around the United States. You're seeing all of these fascinating sort of places.
Yeah.
Was there a, if it wasn't sports psychology, was there another competitor, or was like, no, like this is clearly the path. Like I clearly am on this sports psychology and sort of like counseling sort of.
I think at that point I was pretty committed. And again, being so compelled to tackle the mental aspects of sport and athleticism and sort of being an athlete. I mean, riding your bike 4,532 miles in a row was mentally incredibly challenging, humbling, fascinating, interesting, exciting. And I kept a really detailed journal that summer and just really wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And so no, at that point I knew that I was either going to like do some kind of, I was going to be a coach or a psychologist. I was going in that direction. and found out before I started my bike ride that I got accepted to my master's program. So I knew at the end of that bike ride, I was going to go to school and study again.
You were riding somewhere, as it were,
Yes,
even as you
yes,
were aimlessly wandering.
literally was riding, yes, to
Do
grad
you
school.
still have the journal? I feel like we need to
I
do a podcast,
do.
the dramatic reading of
I
Steph's journal.
do. I do. It's actually a couple of journals because it spilled over. You know, it's classic. Again, no smartphones, no tablets at that time. So good old paper and pen, like leather bound journals. I have them in a box. I'm staring at the box right here in my office. Yes, and I reference them sometimes. Yeah.
It's an amazing experience. Is there anything particular from the bike ride? Like, what's the most memorable sort of thing from the bike ride?
I remember one day riding through Idaho, the state of Idaho. So that summer, it was an El Nino summer from a weather perspective. So we just had so much unexpected headwind, classically, right? And I remember riding my bike through Idaho, and it was one of the days where we were doing quite a bit of uphill riding, and the wind was just against us the whole day. And I remember in my brain writing a poem to the wind. I was talking to the wind the entire day I was riding my bike that day. And it was so humbling. And it was one of those lessons where I was like, you cannot fight the wind. You will lose, right? I'm going to lose if I fight this wind. And so I was like, I have to figure out how to work with the wind. And I wrote a poem. And when I got off my bike that day, I wrote it down in the journal. That, and then the other very, very memorable day, I can't remember it right now. I didn't get it down on paper, but I remember coming up with what I declared was like the most brilliant marketing campaign for Snickers, because I ate a Snickers bar every day, to keep the energy going and get the calories I needed. And I was like, man, I should try to go get a job at Snickers after this is over.
I mean, my love for M&Ms and Snickers as comparison products, and clearly Snickers was working, right? Snickers, it satisfies. Peanuts for power. This is a
Yes.
good, this feels very workable for you in the
Yep.
future, Steph.
Yes.
What
Yep.
an amazing experience. It is interesting, I was talking to somebody the other day about headwinds and tailwinds as analogies for sort of promoting and inhibiting pressures. We were trying to find various analogies to talk about how do we, the effect of pressures on human behavior, right? And
Yeah.
how what we're really doing is we don't change human behavior directly, we change the pressures, which then change human behavior.
Right.
And it is amazing how many just natural headwinds and tailwinds there are. Most of your and my career has been fighting what we often think of as natural systems, right? But in reality, many of those systems are highly constructed, right? They're made by somebody who profits from them, or for whom it behooves them to sort of have that structure in place. But I think a lot about headwinds.
Well, one of the things I love about your model of competing pressures, and it's spot on, is that when you do behavior design work or behavioral sciences work and you dig into the theories that are out there and the frameworks, there's such good work out there. Oh my gosh, there's so many amazing useful frameworks and theories and everything. Is that one of the questions I get the most in our work when I'm working with teams is if we can come up with, to use your language, if we can come up with a really good behavioral statement, or we have a really concrete list of target behaviors that we want to design for, and we're getting really good with our vocabulary and the way we're talking about the behaviors that we want to design for, inevitably teams will always say, well, which one do we start with? How do we prioritize? And a lot of people in our field and a lot of frameworks and theories will answer that question by saying, well, whichever one's easiest is where you should start. Well, how do you know? How do you know? You can ask people which one of these behaviors is easiest for you, but people are really good liars, right? And so what you've done, Matt, with this competing pressures concept and work table is give people the tools to uncover from a research and observations perspective what is potentially the easiest path for the people we're designing for. And I think that's so important.
What's so interesting to me is, I often talk to young behavioral scientists who are on their journey, and they talk about people like you and people that they look up to, and it feels unattainable to them. But I sort of often talk about like, well, the only difference between a junior behavioral science, you cap out on the skills
Yeah.
relatively quickly, right? Like basic, inferential statistics, you sort of learn them and then you know them. And that's probably pretty early in your career, right? That you've sort of maxed out on where you're going to go with that portion of statistics. But it is the instinct for the things like, hey, you can look at a list, that I can give a list of behaviors to somebody like Steph, and you can say, hey, based on my experience, that one, right? That one is probably going to be easier than those other ones, or going to be a good linchpin to start. And some of that's just intuition of like having done it for, I tried to change all these behaviors in different contexts at some point, and I sort of have an inkling of which ones go better and worse. And so it's just experience. And you've had this tremendous, catalog of experience over your career. So back to your path, right? You're in grad school, you're like doing sports psych, doing counseling. When did you get an inkling that maybe it wasn't going to be like one-on-one sort of counseling,
Yeah.
clinical kind of models of psychology, and rather some more, population level kind of thing?
Yep. Thanks for that question. It's a really simple, straightforward answer. I was very lucky. I got a postgraduate position to join a team of sports psychologists in Australia for the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. So if anybody wants to do math, I finished grad school, my first graduate degree in 2000. Okay. And I bought a one-way ticket to Sydney, Australia. The Olympics were happening there that year, and worked with the Australian sport groups. And I was an American working with Australian Olympic athletes to peak perform at their Olympics. So that was really fascinating. And the way my visa worked out was I got a position at Victoria University based in Melbourne. And I taught classes and I ran research groups in the lab and stuff like that. And then worked with them on the applied side with the athletes for the Olympics. And it was that experience that taught me I did not want to do one-on-one. I did not want to be a sports psychology practitioner. I was so lucky to be on the world's stage of sports psychology practice. And I was like, wow, this is not what I want to do at all.
All right, we got to dig into the details. How did you get, you made it, I challenged specifically my guests that are identify as women, often make things sound like luck from the sky. I imagine there's a fair bit of like work that went to how did this come about? Like, you saw this opportunity and it was something you applied for. Like, how did you end up sort of in this place?
So I did my master's thesis on male versus female attitudes towards male versus female coaches. What helped pay for my graduate school at the time was my job, my internship. I was the assistant volleyball coach to the men's volleyball team at Springfield College in Massachusetts. And that was awesome. Oh, such a great experience. The idea of being the only woman, a part of that group, both the staff and obviously all the athletes were men, inspired me to really explore this. So later in that program, I was doing a lot of gender specific research and writing, and two professors from Victoria University came over to the United States to do their sabbatical. They had a sabbatical year. And so they joined my mentors to write a book. And so I was in the right place at the right time when these Australian key opinion leaders and very respected known practitioners came to where I was going to grad school. And we were all having like a graduate professors students dinner one night. And the professors from Australia were saying that with the upcoming Olympics, they were going to be very overwhelmed with their workload because they were full-time professors, full-time researchers, but then they were also the practitioners being retained for the Olympics. And so me being me, I was like, well, if you need help, I'll come down to Australia and help you out with your workload. And that turned into an offer to join them for a year in Australia and take on a bunch of their workload.
And was that like an in the moment blurt, or you had been kind of thinking of this in the back of your head? No, you're just like in the moment, you were like, yeah, that sounds fun. Go.
I found myself in a moment where I was sitting at a table with some of the world's best sports psychologists. And I was like, Stephanie, if you don't grab this moment right now, you're just a doof. And I was like, you got nothing to lose, right? So I just very confidently, casually, calmly said, I am more than happy to come take some of your workload if you need that help. And they
had
said,
you
okay.
graduated? And had you graduated when you went, or
I graduated in May and I flew, again, a one-way ticket. I put a backpack on my back. I got a one-way ticket in June, the next month.
and what did you think was going to happen after? Because the one-way ticket is a part of this story. Like, you're like, I'm going to go do this thing, and then who knows?
I mean, I was in my early 20s at that time, and that's when you just got to ride a wave. You just got to go and make the most of it. And my parents were like, what are you doing? Where are you going? When are you coming home? I'm like,
No,
well,
no.
got this great opportunity and I'm going to go ride the wave. And the visa itself was only for 9 months. So there was some kind of timeline to it. In fact, I overstayed my welcome and got in a little bit of trouble for that because I was just having a lot of fun and wanted to stay. But in the end, it was a fantastic work experience because it taught me what I did not want to do, which is potentially more valuable than figuring out what you want to do.
And was that a process over time, or did you like you had your first session with somebody and was like, nope, or you were like,
I think it was more of a process. I really did go down under with an open mind. I was like, just go be a sponge, learn whatever they ask you to do it. I didn't really have an expectation for what it was going to be or where I was going to end up. It was really, but I kind of thought of it as an extension to my graduate training.
And so then as you're going through it, there's a growing sense that, hey, this one-on-one thing is not it.
Yes.
Yeah. Then you get thrown in jail in Australia, apparently, because I like the 12-year-old Steph and now 22-year-old Steph are basically
There's a
the same
theme.
Steph.
There's a little bit of a theme. I did get in trouble. Yes, yes. But thank God I did all that when I was really young. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if look, we both live in the San Diego area. If I get a call from you from jail, I will happily bail you out.
Thank you.
So you come back, right? You get kicked out of the country. You come back,
Yep.
and then you come back with plans. You come back sort of, and then you just crash land back into the United States and sort of figure it out.
That was tough. That was a really tough transition. I arrived home right before the Christmas holidays, so that was nice in that I went home to my family's house and kind of slept and got over the jet lag. And that was a classic. Like I went home and it was like, oh God, what's next? And I didn't really have a what's next planned. And so in a nutshell, one of my mantras in life is when you don't know what to do, go back to what you know. And what I knew at the time was a whole group of people in the St. Louis area where I went to college. A bunch of my friends were living there, working. And so I said, all right, well, I'm just going to go back to St. Louis where I know people. And I had a friend who had a room available. I could go be back with my friends who were just, starting out and figuring out life. And so that's what I did. I moved back to St. Louis. And Washington University, where I did my undergrad, was just starting to spearhead a department of health and wellness. It was a new endeavor for the university at the time. And so I was able to get a full-time job, joining it was like a tiny little startup, like an incubator inside the university, figuring out what health and wellness for the university was going to mean. And so that was great. So I did that for a few years.
Talk to me about what that experience was. What were you doing? Right. So it sounded like it was, you said, what does health and wellness mean for
Yes.
the
So
uni?
So at the university at the time, the person sort of on the org chart who was responsible for that initiative was the dean of students and residential life.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would sort of use the analogy. It would be like if I went and reported in to the chief human resources officer, right? The person in charge of making sure people are happy, healthy, fulfilled, getting what they need out of their classes, or in my analogy, out of their jobs, like engaged, retained, all of those things. So it was within the Dean of Students and Student Life that the initiative took hold. And I worked for one or two of the deans, in that part of the university. And what we ended up doing the first year was just like a big ethnography. It was discovery. It was visiting different parts of the university, different groups around the university to understand what does health and wellness mean? What do you want it to mean? Is there anything that currently exists that fits that descriptive to you? If so, what? If not, what would you like to see? It was like an entire year or two of discovery. And then it was just some prototyping and building. It was mostly program based. So the things we were designing and creating and inviting others to join us in were programs, maybe stress management programs, or nutrition type programs. I remember we started a cooking club. The students started a cooking club. And so it was a matter of doing a lot of connecting and networking around the university to liaise with, the person who was in charge of all the fraternities and sororities, the head of Greek life, and the athletic department that was in charge of all the student athletes, and just really kind of networking around the university to say, like, because it was a very decentralized effort, right? It was meant to be decentralized so that it could be customized depending on which part of the student life you were designing for.
These are setting up some skills that will benefit you later as an applied behavioral scientist, right?
Yeah.
The ability to bring
Yes.
stakeholders from across an organization
Yes.
together. If I had interviewed, Steph in this period, would you have used the words behavioral science? Like, how would you have described yourself?
No. Health and wellness was it. That's about as far as I got in terms of a label. I called myself a program designer. Oh, actually, that's not true. I called myself at that time a health educator. So when I was working full-time at Washington University at this point in my career, I was a full-time health educator. That was my job.
Got it.
And it was really program design. That's how we were getting out and educating people.
And then this comes to its natural conclusion.
So what happened then was there was some family stuff going on back at home. So I decided to move back closer to home, which again, I grew up in northern New Jersey. So I moved back to connect with my family and decided to then join my sister who was living in New York City, and moved into her place with her in New York City, and took up a job in the Office of Health Promotion at Columbia University, because that was transferable, right?
I was just saying, doing similar kinds of work?
Yes. I discovered that there was a job opening to do health education and program design at Columbia University in New York City. So moved back, moved into a place with my sister, and then was like, okay, I got to find a job. And so I took a full-time job in the Office of Health Promotion at Columbia University.
And so but there's an important pivot in there, right? You go from sort of thinking of yourself as a health educator to thinking of yourself more as a program and design person.
Yes.
Right. Which is an important switch, right? A health educator is still somewhat, it's not one-to-one, but maybe it's one to class.
Yes.
Right. And now you're really saying, no, I'm interested, there's an infrastructure piece here that I'm interested in. There's a design piece here that I'm interested in.
Yep. And what happened actually was what led me to choose to do doctoral work was one of my first projects in this job doing program design at Columbia was, again, I'm going to age myself. I was responsible for redesigning an exercise motivation program for faculty and staff at the university. So there was this very cool program called the 100 Mile Club. MILE stood for Minutes I Log Exercising. And the goal was to invite faculty and staff to participate in the program and get 100 minutes of physical activity per work week. Now, at the time, there was no devices, wearables, nothing. And so we designed this program and delivered it through email. And I pulled together as much of a cross-functional, multidisciplinary group as you can imagine. People from IT, people from design, people from medicine, people from education, people from public health, marketing, you named it. We all kind of got together to work on this, and it was a huge failure. Total flop, did not work. And I didn't know why. I was like, I don't understand. These are all the best practices. We're pulling from all the health behavior change theories that are published in the literature. Why isn't this working? And so I was like, all right, I got to go back to school and I got to figure out why this isn't working.
Looking back now, do you have an inkling of why it didn't work?
Yes. Yes, I could do a really nice diagnostic on the 100-mile club and tell you what was going on and why it didn't work. Yes.
And
Yes, but
did that
that was a North Star for me when I entered my doctoral program.
was to understand some of what had happened in this
Yeah.
experience and unpack
Yes.
that. How did you did you go into your doctoral program thinking, and then I'll become an academic, or did you know you were going to come back out and do applied again?
No, I actually started revisiting clinical again. And that was because Columbia had such a strong clinical psychology program. It still to this day has a phenomenal clinical psych program. But I ended up matriculating into teachers college to do a doctorate in health and behavior science. And so pretty quickly I let go of clinical and decided to go the research route. And really my doctorate was very research heavy. But what was great about it, it was applied research, right? It was, let's do this research, let's be running experiments, doing prototypes, let's get out into the real world and make hay with what we think we're learning from a research perspective.
And was there a part of you that's like, and then I will become a professor, or was like, no, and then I will go back into private industry, and you knew that?
I was really torn. I was equally interested in, wow, I really love academia. It's a really wonderful life. It's challenging. It's full of neat people. Sort of the sky's the limit. You can create things from nothing. But at the same time, it was a little slow for my taste. I was really at this point such an eager beaver. I wanted to get out there, and I was just like, nope, I got to get out there. So,
And how'd you find your way to Aetna?
I towards the end of my doctoral program, I went out all around the New York City area talking to doctors and nutritionists and people who were on the front lines of chronic health conditions, because that was really the playground, for lack of a better phrase, for somebody with my skill set and my interests, was chronic disease, especially pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, where we can use behavioral interventions to try to either slow down or reverse the disease trajectory. So I just went all around, and anybody who would take a meeting with me, I was like, how do you figure out how to interact with your patients, what to prescribe, how to talk to them about their home life and their habits? And nobody had a good answer. So I started my own consulting business, and I pitched to healthcare providers, to people who were nutritionists and dietitians and coaches, and said, I'm going to help you design this program. I'm going to be your program design expert, your health education expert, so that when you're not doing your one-on-ones with your patients, you give them something to work on effectively in between your appointments.
So if I'd interviewed you, you wouldn't have called yourself an applied behavioral scientist yet, but
Nope.
but we've moved from one-on-one to very clearly program design, very clearly like outside of that one-on-one dyadic experience, what else needs to happen in the health ecosystem for that
Yes.
stuff to flourish?
Yes. A lot more systems thinking, a lot more sort of social determinants of health, if you will, right? Like, let's look at the whole person. And hey, you expert dietitian, while you're doing all this very amazing, important clinical prescribing work, what else really matters to making sure this patient can be successful?
Right. Yeah, I've always the S in social determinants. I'm always like, no, situational determinants, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not just, I think people often get captured in sort of the demographic part of that and leave aside all of the sort of larger web of what's going on. So you're out
100%.
there consulting, you're
And by the
talking
way,
to
that is the diamond in the rough in public health behavior design, in my opinion.
the situational piece.
Yes.
Yeah. It's amazing, both of you and I have been at this for a while. It's hard to feel like we're making progress on that one sometimes. I mean, so much of the ecosystem still seems to believe very strongly in like, well, if Steph is fat, it's because she's lazy. And if, Matt is diabetic, it's, God cursed it. It seems very like continues to be this very individual focused thing, as opposed to like, hey, people are part of structures.
Yep.
It's so fascinating to me. I was talking with a friend about diabetes research, something you and I both have a strong interest in. And we were talking about, some recent FDA decisions that didn't go the way that we thought they would go. It's interesting to me that, for example, the CEO of Novo Nordisk is being, you know, called to Congress to talk about the price of pharma drugs. But like, where's the CEO of McDonald's? Like,
Yes.
where are any of the obesogenic, right? Like, where's the CEO of Google talking about the like, or Instagram to talk about the rampant ability to advertise obesogenic, sort of products on their platforms?
Yeah.
No, it's the the cures are too expensive. We're
Yeah.
never going to look at any things that might have led us here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
We could just go down that path for as long as you wanted to.
a very long rabbit. I have a sense that we're probably going to have to do a follow-up podcast. We're going to have to do like Steph's life journey podcast, and then we're going to have to do a maybe we'll get some of our
tackling the situations, which by the way, very few private corporate executive leaders want to have that conversation.
well, I mean, in a world where most companies are publicly traded, shareholder value add is the metric of choice. And a lot of shareholder value add for many, many companies requires the dishealth of American citizens, right? Or people around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And, that until we change some of the market dynamics, it does feel relatively intransient. It's one of the things I loved working at Clover, right? Medicare Advantage is one of those few places where like, hey, you make people healthy, you make a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right. If you could figure out how to change behavior in a way that like actually gets people to, not require medical intervention,
Yeah.
you're actually in a really, really good place. But those
Yeah.
business models are vanishingly small.
Yeah.
So maybe I think we should do a podcast with you, me, and like maybe like Claire Purvis or something. And this will be a like policy only rant. It'd be great.
Absolutely.
So you're consulting around. How does this end up at Aetna?
Right. So Aetna did not happen until I moved to San Francisco. So I spent about a year or two as this sort of freelancer running around New York City to healthcare providers' offices and hospitals and kind of just anybody who would take a meeting with me, pitching my services. And the thing that was the strongest theme that came out of that work was that the healthcare providers themselves were greatly lacking the tools and the technology they needed to support and enable their patients for health. And the tools that were available, frankly, were total shit. They were really poorly designed.
And this is kind of the 2010-ish era.
2008, 2009. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so we have some things exist in the world, but they, to your point, by modern standards, they're not great.
Correct. Yeah, there was no iPhone, there was no Fitbit, there was none of that, right? And so I remember what tools were available. I remember just thinking like, who is designing this stuff? Like, where are the people who know what the healthcare providers actually need, how humans actually want to use these tools in healthcare? Like, where are those people? And one of my friends was like, follow the money. So I did. And that led me to San Francisco, to Silicon Valley. And I remember going to my very first large health tech conference. And I actually have a video. I have a video clip of me being interviewed. This is now 15 years ago. There's a video on the internet of me being interviewed at that conference. And you hear me saying like, I'm here, I'm new to the scene, I'm a behavioral scientist. And people are like, what's that?
So by this time you are using the term.
Well, I was using the term not to describe myself. In fact, that was one of the biggest hurdles in my entrance to the Silicon Valley scene at the time. I did not know what the hell to call myself. And so I was using different labels. And every time it was basically like, human factors or behavioral scientist or health educator, people would look at me like I was an alien, because at the time it was almost exclusively tech driven, appropriately so. That's how a lot of modern age, industries come to be. It's the engineers who have their feet on the gas pedals, just like going, let's build these things. So here I was at this large health tech conference, hands down, for sure, the only social scientist out of like 1,000 people, I'm sure. Mostly investors, technologists, business people. And I remember just watching demo after demo after demo of these technologies, thinking to myself, no human is ever going to use that thing ever. And there was one guy who still is in business today, very successful startup entrepreneur, who stood up on stage and demoed his startup. And I was the only person who at the end stood up and clapped and like, woo, like he was doing human-centered design, understood, the science of behavior and how humans kind of do things. And it was like, I was like, yes, okay.
So revelatory.
And so that got me going in San Francisco. And basically for the next 6-7 years, I was a full-time freelance consultant. And I picked up a gig to do research and teach at Stanford at the D.school.
And how did had you reached out to when you arrived, you were sort of like, hey, I've done this sort of academic stuff. Like, what's going on with you?
I was having lunch with somebody in San Francisco. I think it was like through a meetup or something. I moved to San Francisco not knowing one single person. It was very scary. I don't know if you're noticing a theme in my early life, like one-way tickets or like.
Well, it's one-way tickets in jail are the two.
We were done with jail by this time. But this time I was entering my 30s and there was no more jail, but there were still one-way tickets, right? And so I bought a one-way ticket to San Francisco, and I was like, I got to go figure this out. Like, what's happening? And I was lunching with somebody through a meetup group, and I was explaining my work. And this person said to me, there's a guy at Stanford. His name is BJ Fogg. You should reach out to him and let him know about your work. And so I did. And BJ is wonderful. And he invited me to come visit him at Stanford and sit in on a couple sessions inside his lab. And that's what got me going for Stanford. And so I joined him and did a bunch of research in his lab, and that eventually got me further into the community at the university, and was able to spend a couple of years teaching at the D.school.
And at the time, were you still like, no, but I want to do this applied, outside consulting stuff? Or was there a temptation to go back and be a professor again?
Well, I mean, Stanford is pretty special. And so I was loving the research and the teaching. But at that point in my career, I had come to greatly value being able to do both. Because the idea is that you experiment and you do research and you take risks and you kind of explore and you get really creative in the academic space. And then you go apply that in the real world to see if it works. And all the things that you learn in the real world, you bring back into the lab and into the classroom. And so this symbiotic relationship between taking big risks and getting really creative and experimentation and science inside the university, and then going out into the wild, messy, real world and applying is pretty much how I've done my career since.
How does San Diego come? Like, you're in the Bay, you're doing the thing.
Yep. So I had my own practice. So by the way, Aetna happened because I picked up Aetna as one of my clients as a consultant, and I had a wonderful working relationship with them for a little while. So I did a lot of work with them on some really fantastic things. They were asking really exciting questions at the time. I was living in San Francisco in 2013 when I met my now husband, and not soon after we found out we were pregnant, and we got priced out of the city, as people do. And my sister, at the time, it was and is raising her family here in North County, San Diego. So we moved to San Diego for personal reasons.
And you were commuting back up to Stanford, right?
Yeah. So the first year that I was based in San Diego, I was really lucky. I had the support to go back up to teach classes at Stanford. So I was doing the commute between San Diego and all my clients that were paying me were San Francisco based, right? Because I had a thriving consulting practice in San Francisco. So yes, but I had 2 babies in 20 months and got really tired really fast. So then I was like, I got to find a job in San Diego.
And was Tandem like and I'm going to go to Tandem, or you kind of looked around the San Diego scene
No,
and started trying to.
so again, when you don't know what to do, go back to what you know. And what I knew a lot about was diabetes. And I had done
Hmm.
an enormous amount of work, both especially on pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, I was a little bit less familiar with. But the combination of just going to the internet to see what diabetes companies, exist in the San Diego area led me to learn about Tandem. And at the time I have a niece who lives with type 1 diabetes. And so when I learned about Tandem and Dexcom and some of the other really exciting companies here in San Diego tending to insulin delivery, I called my family, and I said, do you know about these companies? And they said wonderful things. They raved about Tandem. So I cold called Tandem.
Who'd you
Um,
call?
I got in touch with their talent acquisition team.
Hmm.
And what I didn't know at the time, and this was back in early 2017, what I didn't know at the time is Tandem Diabetes Care was going through a pretty hard time financially because of a bunch of different market factors. And they had at the time an incredible leadership team that was leading the company with an enormous amount of transparency. And so they were sharing with the employees at the time that there was some financial distress going on. So this is where some serendipity did come into the picture. The human factors team working at Tandem Diabetes Care left and went to go work for a different company. So there was this sort of like hole in terms of a very important and required practice because Tandem sells regulated medical devices. So they have to do human factors research to deliver to the FDA.
Yeah, this is sort of a like there are subtitles here for those of you not in this industry. When you are selling a regulated physical device, you have
Yes.
to prove to the FDA that this device can be used by humans. It's sort of human
Yes.
centric, like that a normal
Yes.
person could figure out how to use this. It's
Yes.
sort of an unknown step for a lot of people. I think because so many of the devices feel very hard to use or very bad, right?
Yeah.
They're like, nobody's thinking about this. And actually, like, you should see it before the
Yeah.
human factors people get a hold of it. Then it's really bad.
Yes. Yes. And to this day, some of my dearest friends and closest colleagues are the engineers who make these machines. And they'll be the first ones to say that. I actually have done lectures where I show what the first version of a prototype looks like that the engineers made in their lab. And then the after product that ends up being the commercial version that like real people use. And the work that goes on in between those two phases is just so important and such a great application for people who are trained in behavioral science and human factors and human computer interaction, right?
Well, it's you don't have to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out what behavior you want. You know what behavior you're like, I want them to be able to use the device,
Yes.
For a lot of companies, the coming up with a behavioral statement is the biggest struggle. It's figuring out like of all of the behaviors we could change around something, where is their financial opportunity?
Yes.
In hardware devices, I know what I want. I want you to
Yes.
use the thing correctly, and we even kind of know what correctly means, right?
Yes.
And so their team had left. There was this sort of human factors sized hole,
Yes.
and so you sort of pitched yourself as like, hey, I can help fill this hole.
I did. I did. So the American Diabetes Association convention was going to be happening in San Diego. It was in San Diego in 2017. So I was going to go to network anyway. It's an event that I had been to before. And the talent acquisition person, who's just the most wonderful woman, said to me, since you're going to the American Diabetes Association conference soon, go to the Tandem Diabetes booth, right on the floor where all the companies do their displays. Go over to the Tandem group, look for the tallest, baldest man standing there. That's Brian Hansen. He's the chief commercial officer. He was the chief commercial officer at the time at Tandem. And she said, just go talk to him. Go tell Brian your story. Tell him what you do. So I did. When the American Diabetes Association conference came around, I showed up and I walked over to the Tandem booth. I mean, the guy is 6'7", 6'8", 6'9". He's a tall dude, maybe 6'10". He's
Easy to
tall.
find.
Yeah, I could find him, no problem. And I just said, hi, Brian. My name is Steph, and I'm a behavioral scientist, and I'd love to tell you why Tandem could use behavioral sciences. And he said, I don't know what that is. It sounds very expensive. Why don't you sit down and tell me your story? So I did. And he just basically left me with love it, love it, love it, love everything you're saying, can't afford you, not now. And again, I didn't know at the time that they had quite a bit of financial stress happening. But I also knew that they had to figure out how to get their human factors work done. Like that was a non-negotiable
Right.
for
Because it's
them. Now
required by the
they didn't have to
FDA.
choose, right. They didn't have to choose me to do human factors, but they had to do human factors. So a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from Brian and he just said, "Can you do human factors?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Can you do market research?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Great. Why don't you come in and help us stay afloat?" And that was the greatest, most wonderful invitation potentially of my career. And I quickly fell in love with the product, the pipeline, the mission, the leadership, the people who worked there. And so when Brian invited me to join full time a couple months later, the only thing I said to him was, "Can I start up a behavioral sciences unit?" And he's like, "Yeah, do whatever you want. Just come work here."
I
And
love
so I
that.
did that.
I love that you took the opportunity of a company that was, sort of like your one-way ticket strategy. I joined Microsoft at a time when Microsoft, the shine was off, the, stock had been flat, like Google was cleaning our clock, right?
Yep.
There is something magical about distressed companies and
Yes.
behavioral science because it's an opportunity, they're at that change inflection moment. And so there's an opportunity if you're willing to sort of, you know, bet on the underdog that you can have a pretty, and you were at Tandem for damn near 7 years. You were there a long time.
Yes, I joined in 2017 and I just left very recently. So, summer of 2024, yes, 7 years. It was a magical ride. We did so much exciting new work. And the people who are still working there are some of the best people I've ever worked with and hired, and they're absolutely amazing. I think to your point about distressed companies, I remember coming home the day that I decided to join Tandem full time, and my husband, who studies the markets and is familiar with how finance works and everything, he kind of knew a little bit about, once I mentioned Tandem and I was interested, he looked up the financials and I told him I was going to join full time. And he's like, "Are you crazy? Well, this company's on the brink of bankruptcy." And I remember saying to him, "Here's the deal. If they go bankrupt, they go bankrupt. And then the next day I wake up and I go try to find another job. But if they don't go bankrupt, that's going to be very interesting." Right. And I really believed in the mission, in the product that they had, in the product pipeline. And most importantly, I believed in the leadership. And I think that's what I would say to any person who's giving a look or having a consideration around a distressed company or a company that's in trouble, as they say. Really get to know the leadership because that's your make or break. You got to believe in the leaders and how they're leading and the decisions they're making.
Was it hard to leave? You were there a long time. You built a whole team and infrastructure and managing a ton of folks. You had human factors under you, you had behavioral science under you.
Yeah.
Was it tough to walk away from that?
Impossible. It was probably one of the hardest decisions of my career, especially because of the social equity that somebody can build up when you're at a place for 7 years, right? And particularly in the early days at Tandem, kind of being in the, as we call, foxholes with one another, kind of working to survive and being the underdog in the market, you really develop close ties to those work friends. So that was almost impossible to walk away from. And it was not a decision that I took lightly. However, the very first product and project that I worked on back in 2017 is one that Tandem just launched commercially. And so that was a really beautiful bookend opportunity for me from a project and portfolio perspective, that this early stage, early concept, sort of on the shelf idea, which was the very first thing I got to roll up my sleeves around with the engineers, to see it get commercialized and be sold and be used out in the real world by real people and families, and to see them doing well just felt like the right time.
Yeah, certainly I think there are epochs at places, and you come to the end of an epoch and you decide, hey, do I want to sign up for the next whatever version of this is, which is often,
Yeah.
when you're at a senior leader, you're signing up for a 3 or 4 or 5 year commitment.
Yeah.
Those epochs are longer when you're more senior because there's a portfolio underneath you and those sorts of things.
And you have commitments. Yeah. I think that's right. It was time for this era to end, right? And it's time for my next era. And I don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like or who that's going to be with, but I am very excited.
And I'm excited for you. I mean, one of the biggest problems we have at BeSci.io is there are just so few senior leaders in behavioral science. It's the hardest position for us to fill. A company will start a team and they'll say, hey, you have to move to, wherever it is. And there's just not that many people to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And it often is we work with CEOs who are like very surprised that they have such a hard time finding senior talent. And so it's a very rare opportunity when somebody like you comes on the market, and there's a little bit of a feeding frenzy that will happen around it. And I love watching those sort of happen. And I love watching where people end up, people like you and Claire Purvis and other things, because, there's this opportunity space, but it's a limited window. And you're launching out into such an interesting market too, right? You talked about back in the days of 2008, 2009, there's a bunch of products that were there that don't exist anymore because they were badly designed, well-funded, but badly designed. Mm-hmm. We're now having, I think, another reckoning in the health tech space of really well-funded things that people are like, wow, you didn't really do much, right? You didn't really have the impact that you promised you had. You failed to change behavior in these ways. So I think and just like Tandem, in that distress, there is opportunity. Yes. So I'm so excited to see where you end up. I think we have to do this again. I think we have to do one maybe on our gripes about health policy, because I think that is a fascinating space to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me, Steph. It's always so fun. For those that don't know, Steph and I are friends outside of the podcast. We live in San Diego. Our kids play, we play. And so it is lovely to see you in this context. And I'll see you with the kids soon.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Steph.